started. So it's very exciting to be able to welcome Raj Dasgupta here to be our colloquium speaker. Raj is the Maurice Ewing Professor of Earth Systems Science at Rice University. And Raj started out his academic career as a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, where he worked with Mark Hirschman, before moving to a postdoc fellowship at Vermont, where he worked with Dave Walker. And then he started at Rice in 2008. So Raj studies the behavior of volatiles during planetary formation and differentiation and evolution. And I think one of the cool aspects of Raj's work is that he goes all the way from the core to the atmosphere of these planetary bodies. So he studied, volatile partitioning between the core and the lower mantle, but he's also looked at how volatiles affect mantle melting, and he's looked at crustal reservoirs of volatiles, and then also how magma oceans degas and produce our atmospheres. So today he's going to be talking about observations from the lab and the meteorite record that constrain the origin of terrestrial volatiles. And the title of his talk is The Acquisition of Life-Essential Volatile Elements on the Earth and Other Solar System Rocky Bodies. So thanks very much, Raj, for joining us.
Thanks, Megan, for the invitation and for this kind introduction. And I definitely enjoyed all the chats, virtual chats. I wish I could be there in person, but this has been wonderful. So as Megan said, what I'm going to do today is to talk a bit about acquisition of nitrogen and some of the other related life essential elements like carbon and sulfur on Earth and other rocky bodies in our solar system. This is a work that I have been doing now almost for 10 years, it seems, and I have many of the work that I'll be sharing today will primarily come from the PhD work of my current graduate student, Damanveer Grewal, but different parts of the work has been contributed by many others, including lab manager Kyusei Tsuno, intern Taylor Huff, Alexander Farnell, has some collaboration with Bernard Marty at CRPG, and some of my former students and postdocs whose names are all given down here. So we are interested in the origin of these life essential volatile elements, as we call it, in rocky reservoirs, because we think it's truly a key step towards building a habitable planet. The reason we are focusing on the origin of these life essential elements in the entire planet scale reservoir, because if you look at any short-term cycling of key life essential volatile elements such as carbon here, there the element is cycled between hydrosphere, atmosphere, biosphere, and so on for our planet. And the timescales of such cycling is, tens of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years at best. But there exists another cycle where the same element actually is exchanged between the deeper reservoirs of rocky planets and the surface, where the element is exchanged through volcanism and tectonic activities. And in that type of long-term cycling, the element residence time in the deeper reservoirs can be as high as millions of years or billions of years. So if you are thinking about the concept of chemical habitability of a rocky planet, you should be thinking about the cycling of these elements, not just at the surface, not just the availability of these elements at the surface of that rocky planet, but the budget of these elements in whole planet scale, because habitability is truly a dynamic concept. It's not a static concept. A planet can start out habitable and go to inhabitable conditions and vice versa. So rocky planets' habitability should be thought in that context in a whole planet scale process. And this is, of course, now even more important, not just for our own planet and the solar system rocky planets. Through NASA and many other space agencies, we are increasingly more and more interested about finding habitable niches in other solar systems beyond our own, right? We keep finding different exoplanets. Many of them are rocky super Earths, or some of them are sub-Neptunes and whatnot. But in order for us to understand which of these worlds potentially could be habitable or may have the right conditions in terms of availability of chemical ingredients, surface conditions, having right temperatures, and so on, we need to understand our own solar system's evolution and how our own planet manage to acquire these life essential elements. And that sort of is going to be the focus of my talk today. So in terms of the origin of life essential elements, our focus is understanding the origin of these elements for what we are going to call the bulk silicate earth, or the BSE. The reason is over the entire history of our planet, the silicate reservoirs of our planet, the mantle and the crust, and the surface, hydrosphere, atmosphere, they have been in constant communication. So for a volcanically and tectonically active planet, if we can understand how the whole BSE got its volatiles early on, that is actually an interesting key step, or the first step to understand how eventually the atmosphere could be stabilized and built over time, and so on. So basically, it has implications for long-term climate and habitability. So our goal throughout the talk, what I'll try to do is to understand how nitrogen budget of the BSE, or how carbon budget or sulfur budget of the BSE got established, right? Rather than asking the question, oh, how only the exosphere or atmosphere, hydrosphere got these volatiles. Oh, by the way, if you have questions, just probably unmute yourself and ask me as I go along, because I can't really see all of your faces, and there may be things popping up at the chat, but if you just unmute yourself and ask me, that's probably the easiest. Okay, so in terms of the source of life essential volatiles for our planet, the existing paradigm, or at least still the dominant paradigm, I would say, is that the building block of our planet was these chondritic meteorites that we occasionally sample from the asteroid belt, and these are the building blocks for the inner solar system planets. Here is a picture of a chondritic meteorite for your reference. And the reason we think these chondritic meteorites are the source, or why we thought up to this point that why these are the source for volatiles, is based on the isotopic compositions of the major volatile elements. It seems that the bulk silicate earth, which is shown by the star here, is quite similar to several of the carbonaceous chondrites, especially the CI chondrite and so on. So based on that, the existing paradigm for quite some time has been that late accretion of these undifferentiated volatile rich meteorites brought in the volatiles to our planet. So that means if that is really the case, volatile elements were delivered post-dating the major differentiation event for our planet, or in other words, post-dating core formation. But interestingly, although isotopic compositions of volatile elements roughly pointed towards carbonaceous chondrite type of heritage, if you looked at constraints from stable isotopes of non-volatile elements, here there is this classic paper by Paul Warren from 2011 with titanium isotopic composition versus chromium, oxygen isotope versus chromium. You can see that the carbonaceous chondrite group and the non-carbonaceous chondrite groups, they plot in two distinct clusters, with the inner solar system planets such as Earth and Mars and so on, actually falling much closer to the non-carbonaceous group, right? So the volatile elements isotopic compositions and non-volatile element isotopic compositions, in terms of this genetic heritage, they kind of paint two distinct pictures in terms of what the building blocks may have been. Interestingly, one thing we have looked at, these, you can call these like poor man's isotopes. Instead of looking at isotopes, if you look at just elemental abundances. So what this is concentration of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and hydrogen. This is abundance in the bulk silicate earth normalized by CI chondrite. So of course, these are all depleted with respect to CI chondrite. That's not a surprise because we think these are volatile elements, so we probably lost them as planet formed. But what is interesting here is, of course, these are estimated by many different techniques. It's not so straightforward sometimes to estimate their abundances for the whole mantle, volume. But the approaches that have been used by various studies are outlined here. What's interesting here is they're depleted with respect to CI chondrite. That's fine, but their relative abundance is not chondritic, right? Carbon to nitrogen ratio of the BSE is superchondritic, carbon to sulfur ratio is chondritic, and carbon to hydrogen ratio is subchondritic, right? So if these elements were established into the BSE by some sort of a post-core formation, late accretion process, we would expect these elements to be in chondritic abundance, right? This line would be like a flat line rather than this type of shape, right? So this alone kind of tells you right away that late accretion of chondritic material actually cannot explain the relative abundance pattern of the major volatiles in our planet. So that type of picture over the years gradually are pushing our thought process into this type of a picture that perhaps we need to be thinking more and more about delivery of these volatiles, not by these undifferentiated primitive, so-called primitive chondrites, but rather by differentiated bodies. And the reason we stress on that is if you think or if you pay attention to the time scale of evolution of dust and pebbles and then to planetesimals and planetary embryos in the very, very early stage of our solar systems, you will see that based on the heating related to short-lived radionuclide like aluminum-26 and so on, the differentiation, the metal silicate separation, atmospheric loss, all of these processes started really, really early in small parent bodies, right? So formation of planetesimals and undifferentiated, differentiated, that started within, very, very soon, right after the birth of the solar system. So, and then there was the formation of the moon or Mars-sized planetary embryo in this type of time scale, and Earth-like planet, a large one, eventually grew over 10 to 100 million year time scales through giant impacts and mergers of multiple planetary embryos. So what this sort of suggests that rather than Earth growing entirely from undifferentiated bodies, differentiated bodies were abundantly available by the time final makeup and growth of our planet took place. So the question then becomes, what would be the fate of different major volatiles if our planet got them not only through some chondrites perhaps, but also through differentiated bodies that developed over many different timescales, right from the start or the formation of CAIs all the way to the final moon forming giant impact. This is basically the same thing again, just making the point slightly differently. If you look at the fractional mass of many different bodies such as asteroid for Vesta, Mars, and Earth, many of the differentiated bodies like Mars and Vesta, they fully formed much earlier than the final formation timescale of our own planet. So differentiated bodies with potentially different internal structures and compositions were already available by the time Earth finally grew. So kind of the background motivation of this talk is to try to see through these processes and trace the fate of volatiles and ask the question, as far as the origin of volatiles go in our planet, what is the role of these processes, these early differentiation processes in smaller bodies, right? And whether or not that has some implications for the origin of volatiles in our own planet. So in order to do that, because we are now talking about not delivery of major volatiles through undifferentiated bodies, we are talking about delivery of volatiles through differentiated bodies. The two main, I guess, parameters that we need to know in terms of fate of volatiles during differentiation processes are solubility of volatiles in molten silicates, or exchange of these volatiles with proto-atmosphere and molten silicates. You can think of it, exchange of these volatiles between sort of proto-atmosphere and the magma ocean just below, and partitioning of these volatile elements during metal silicates separation or core formation processes. So in that case, we are talking about partition coefficient of each of these volatiles between alloy and silicate. So volatile content in the alloy melt relative to volatile content in the silicate melt. So as an experimentalist, what I have started doing over the last 10 years is to develop an experimental campaign where we kind of gradually march along and try to understand the systematics of solubility of each of these species in silicate melt and partitioning of these species as a function of many different intensive and extensive variables like pressure, temperature, magma compositions, oxygen fugacity, and so on for each of these volatiles, each on their own as well as their interplay, right? And And the thing that is unique, one may think, oh, well, didn't igneous petrologists by now figure out the solubility of, carbon, nitrogen, water and sulfur? And this is a field which is at least, 50 to 100 years old. Well, the thing is, if you have been doing igneous geochemistry in the context of magma generation in our planet, you have been mostly concerned about solubility and partitioning at conditions that are far more oxidized than the conditions we are mostly interested in terms of the formation conditions of terrestrial planets. So these are much more reducing conditions, and as a consequence, we are kind of exploring parameter spaces that are quite distinct than, let's say, the conditions where magma generation takes place in our planet at the present day, right? That's why these needed new experimental campaigns. So as I pointed out right at the beginning, the talk today is contributed by many in my group over the years, but today's content is really, really driven heavily by my current student, Daman Grewal. So all the good things you will hear, if there are any, it will be all his credit, and everything that are messed up, that's mine. Okay, so get him back to get the good side of the story. Okay, so as I said before, it's basically an experimental campaign. Many of the thought processes, at least part of my talk, will be driven by the experimental data we have generated over the years on solubility and partitioning of major volatiles. So these are sort of high pressure temperature experiments using piston cylinder, multi-anvil. These are a couple of backscattered electron images that kind of tell you what type of experimental products we can generate. You can have these bright phases, which are analogs of segregating core or metallic liquid surrounded by silicate matrix. So we can, from these experiments, we can figure out solubility, we can figure out partitioning. It actually requires a pretty thorough analytical campaign to go with the experiments, microprobe, ion microprobe, different types of spectroscopy, because unlike partitioning of passive trace elements, these major volatiles actually, their partitioning or solubility behavior actually get influenced by speciation, like how they dissolve, right? So as a consequence, not just elemental concentration technique is sufficient. We needed to do a thorough spectroscopic studies of these glasses to figure out how are the volatiles dissolving, and to truly understand the underlying mechanism of partitioning and solubility. So going back to that original question of how did these major volatiles potentially got established in our bulk silicate Earth, based on the plot I showed you before of the relative abundances, I would right off the bat rule out late veneer addition or late accretion post-dating core formation as the major process, because that at least direct chondrite delivery doesn't work. Whatever was delivered, it could be post-dating core formation, but some sort of processes must have modified them, because otherwise the abundance pattern cannot be explained. So then two other major processes that could be considered in the context of our own planet, like protoplanet or our Earth, are atmospheric loss and or core-mantle fractionation in shaping the relative abundance or the absolute abundances of these volatiles. So for atmospheric loss to be a major player, and again, I'll take you back to that same diagram I showed before. So you need to establish this abundance pattern for the bulk silicate Earth. And remember, the bulk silicate Earth, the way we are defining it, it's the atmosphere, hydrosphere, crust, mantle all together. We are calling it bulk silicate Earth, but it's all the entire non-metallic reservoir of our planet, right? So in order for us to establish that, the atmosphere that we need to lose would need to have this type of characteristics. So the atmosphere needs to be nitrogen rich relative to carbon. The atmosphere should be similar abundance in terms of carbon and sulfur, and it needs to be carbon rich relative to hydrogen, right? Because that's how you might be able to produce this depletion of nitrogen relative to carbon and keep the carbon and sulfur abundance similar and so on. So if that's what you need to do, if you need to create or stabilize an atmosphere with these type of characteristics, the underlying magma ocean or that silicate melt solubility needs to be complementary, right? So the only way you need to be able to fractionate the volatiles between the vapor phase, overlying vapor phase, and the underlying silicate melt is to have solubility in the silicate melts that are just the opposite, meaning nitrogen should be sparingly soluble in the melt, carbon should be more soluble, carbon and sulfur solubility should be similar, and so on and so forth, right? So we can test it whether that was really the case. So that's what we have been kind of doing. So what this plot is carbon solubility in silicate melt as a function of oxygen fugacity. Many of you may not be familiar with the scale of oxygen fugacity. All you need to know is if you go to the right of this plot, you are getting more oxidized. If you go to the left, you are getting more reduced. It's oxygen fugacity relative to the equilibrium between iron metal and iron oxide. But that's details in terms of what buffer means and so on. I won't bore you with that. But all of these conditions are such that silicate melt could be coexisting with an iron-rich metallic melt. So these things are reduced. And the thing you need to just know, there are lots of structures in these data and lots of explanation. But the bottom line is carbon had very low solubility in this type of systems. So the carbon solubility in silicate melts and at these conditions are in the order of 10 to hundreds of ppm, right, by weight. So relatively low solubility. In contrast, if you look at nitrogen solubility in silicate melts, and by the way, I'm in a hurry, I took this plot. This is not truly a solubility plot. This is actually a nitrogen content in silicate melt, again, as a function of oxygen fugacity, similarly reducing conditions. And these were nitrogen content in silicate melt when the melt was in equilibrium with a metallic melt. So this is not solubility. The solubility would be even higher than this, like true solubility at these conditions. But nonetheless, the point can be made, as you can see, compared to the previous plot for carbon, where the solubility was in the order of, again, what was that? Hundreds of ppm, right? Hundreds to 1,000 ppm by weight. Here, the nitrogen solubility is in the order of weight percent. So 10,000 ppm, 20,000 ppm, right? So nitrogen is much more soluble in this type of reducing systems compared to carbon. So does that work? Well, it actually doesn't, because the nitrogen solubility in silicate melt is much greater than carbon solubility in silicate melt. And I have not shown you, but sulfur solubility in silicate melt is also much greater than carbon solubility in silicate melt at these reducing conditions. So that means with that type of magma ocean, the equilibrium atmosphere that you can create, and even if you blow that atmosphere off, that atmospheric blow off would leave a subchondritic carbon nitrogen ratio and subchondritic carbon sulfur ratio for the bulk silicate earth. That's not what we see. Our present day bulk silicate earth has superchondritic carbon nitrogen ratio and chondritic carbon sulfur ratio. So at least equilibrium degassing of the magma ocean and blowing off that equilibrium degassed overlying atmosphere doesn't really allow you to establish the bulk silicate earth major volatile abundance pattern. So the first one is down, second one is down, the next one is core-mantle fractionation, right? Like does the terrestrial core formation, did it lead to the BSC abundance pattern that we see? So this again has been investigated through many experimental projects or experimental papers over the years. This is just one quick summary plot by my former postdoc Yuan Li's work in 2016. So what is this now is, instead of the solubility, the y-axis has the partition coefficient of carbon between alloy and silicate, right? So if it is greater than 1, that means carbon is a siderophile element. If it is less than 1, then carbon is a lithophile element. And it's plotted against oxygen fugacity. Again, similarly reducing conditions. What you see is carbon is a strongly siderophile element. Its partition coefficient of carbon between alloy and silicate, it's in the order of 1,000, 100 to 1,000, depending on, and again, there are lots of structures. These are the details how carbon partition coefficient varies as a function of pressure, temperature, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is carbon is super siderophile. Okay. Sulfur, as it turns out, is also siderophile, but it's much less siderophile. So this is now sulfur partitioning between alloy and silicate as a function of oxygen fugacity. As you get more and more reducing, sulfur becomes less and less siderophile, or gradually becomes more and more lithophile. Actually, this is one here. So sulfur is also siderophile, but less siderophile than that of carbon. So what that means, if you plot the ratio of dC over ds, meaning partitioning of carbon between alloy and silicate relative to partitioning of sulfur between alloy and silicate, that ratio is again much greater than 1, right? So carbon's metal affinity is much greater than sulfur's metal affinity. So if you then do equilibrium core formation in our planet, in the magma ocean, terrestrial magma ocean, and you allow the core to strip away carbon and sulfur relative, similar to based on what is predicted by these experiments, equilibrium core-mantle fractionation would leave a bulk silicate earth that is subchondritic, right? It would strip away more carbon than sulfur. If you start out with a chondritic reservoir, you would end up with a subchondritic bulk silicate earth. But that's not what we see. We see the bulk silicate earth to be chondritic. So again, equilibrium core formation in terms of carbon and sulfur leads to some sort of a problem. Our relatively new things over the last 2, 3, 4 years now, again, primarily led by Daman, has been looking at nitrogen, right? So now we wanted to bring into the mix, what does nitrogen tell us? So this is now a similar plot, nitrogen partition coefficients between alloy and silicate, lots of experiments by different groups, mostly by Daman, but some other as well. Again, plotted as a function of more reducing conditions here, less reducing conditions there. Interestingly, what nitrogen shows is a very interesting behavior. In fact, among all the volatile elements, nitrogen shows the greatest sensitivity with respect to dependence on oxygen fugacity as far as metal silicate partition coefficient goes. It starts out with strongly siderophile at oxidizing conditions, and it can show lithophile behavior if you go to very, very reducing conditions. So again, our interest in this project was to figure out this relative contribution, right? Like the relative partitioning between carbon and nitrogen. So again, we are now here plotting dC over dN, partitioning of carbon between alloy silicate divided by that of the same thing for nitrogen. Again, dC over dN are all greater than 1, right? So that means carbon's metal affinity is greater than nitrogen's, and equilibrium core formation would produce a subchondritic CN ratio, because carbon would be stripped away preferentially relative to nitrogen. But again, I'll remind you, the bulk silicate earth CN ratio is estimated to be superchondritic, right? So this also leads to a problem. So we, of course, wanted to be thorough. We wanted to see, okay, we will build a model and a fully parameterized partition coefficients for all of these major volatiles, and try to figure out, as the planet grows as our planet grew through accretion, different sizes, we will apply metal silicate partition coefficients at different level of equilibration, and truly consistently figure out what type of silicate abundance pattern you can generate for these major volatiles. And that's what is shown here. This is the modeled bulk silicate earth. There are 2 panels, one where the bulk silicate earth abundance pattern for carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, hydrogen, it's only influenced by metal silicate separation or core formation, and the panel to the right is core formation plus atmospheric blow off, both kind of combined. And of course, there are many different types of core formation models you can play with, where the extent of metal silicate equilibration varies, like all the way from 100% and less, meaning partly disequilibrium core formation and so on and so forth. And that's why you have different curves here depending on the extent of alloy silicate equilibration. But these are the patterns you generate, right? Where carbon is depleted most, followed by nitrogen, followed by sulfur, followed by hydrogen, right? But this is what the abundance pattern of the bulk silicate earth at the present day, right? The one in red. So what it shows, that neither equilibrium core formation nor core formation plus atmospheric blow off, if you do that in our planet, in our growing body, in a deep magma ocean, you cannot generate this type of abundance pattern through that early differentiation processes. It always leads to much more depletion of carbon relative to nitrogen, followed by sulfur. You don't generate this nitrogen depletion pattern. So this has been a problem for us because none of these worked. So we were like, what's going on, right? So then again, we kind of said, well, we are experimentalists, we can be creative, right? We can figure out other ways to fix the problem. So we reminded ourselves that, again, a large planet like ours, must not have grown, again, at the point I tried to make right at the beginning, must not have grown by amalgamation of these undifferentiated bodies and interdifferentiation taking place in the proto-earth and the growing earth itself. Our planet must have grown by mergers of already differentiated bodies. So if you allow that concept to be a factor, you can try to determine similar type of fractionation patterns, not just for the composition of the core that we think is broadly relevant for our planet, which is very low in light elements, mostly mostly iron alloy. If you go to these other planetary bodies, and we have examples of these, right? Like, let's say, Brent body of Uranite or Mars. Many of these are thought to be bodies with core compositions that are quite different than that of ours, right? Mercury as well. Like, some of these are very, very silicon-rich core. Some of these are thought to be much more sulfur-rich core, and so on. So we said, okay, does this fractionation pattern change if we allow our compositional parameter space to expand beyond what we think is the final makeup of our planet? So as it turns out, there were already quite a bit of hints about these from the metallurgy data. What we did is just expanded these data sets to high pressure using our high pressure experiments. Sorry, the plots are busy, lots of data. I apologize for that. What these are rather than partitioning, this is now solubility of carbon in the alloy melt rather than carbon solubility in the silicate melt. This is carbon solubility in the alloy melt as a function of sulfur content in the alloy melt. And similarly, carbon solubility in the alloy melt as a function of silicon content in the alloy melt. What you see is in both of these plots, if you allow the sulfur or the silicon content of the core to be much more rich or much more higher values, the carbon solubility in the core can drop quite a bit. So that means even though carbon otherwise wants to behave in a siderophile manner, the saturation limit in the core is reached at very, very easily, meaning carbon, although it wants to enter the core melt, it cannot, because it reaches that solubility limit in the core melt. And as a consequence, carbon can be expelled in the form of graphite and diamond from that segregating core liquid. And you can elevate the silicate reservoir not by equilibrium partitioning behavior, but by liberation of that excess carbon from the segregating core liquid, right? There could be just like reverse rain, if you will, from the core for graphite, or graphite flotation from the core in a way, segregating core, not from the core itself, right? And that's interesting, because the reason that's interesting is now this gives us a potential mechanism of enriching carbon relative to nitrogen for the silicate reservoirs of these rocky bodies. So this is not happening in our planet. This is happening in some other planetary embryo that has this sulfur-rich or silicon-rich core, right? In that type of system, carbon can be expelled from the segregating core liquid because of low solubility. So if that's the case, what we wanted to ask ourselves is, can we establish, so we know that can we establish the present day bulk silicate earth carbon, nitrogen, sulfur abundance patterns and the CN and CS ratios if we allow an impactor that has that relatively sulfur rich core to bring in the volatiles, to bring in the major volatiles through merger, through some sort of a giant impact merger with the proto-earth that originally was volatile depleted, or at least not super enriched in volatiles. So we had all our thermodynamic relationships with the experimental data. We varied the bulk sulfur content of the planetary embryo. We varied the bulk carbon content of the planetary embryo. We set the bulk nitrogen and made it sort of some ratio of the bulk carbon. And we wanted to set up some sort of an inverse Monte Carlo simulations to see, is there any way we can establish the BSE abundance pattern? And if we can, what does it tell us in terms of the composition and the size of that impactor? Composition or the size of that planetary embryo that could allow us to establish our planet's BSE's volatile abundance pattern. So these three panels here gives you that solution space. So what we plot within this color shade here are all solutions that work, meaning all of these actually allow us to make that BSE abundance pattern that I have been telling you guys about. So what you can see is with modest amount of carbon, bulk carbon in that planetary embryo, if the bulk sulfur content of the planetary embryo lies within this range, but if the core sulfur content of that planetary embryo falls somewhere between 20 and 30%, so relatively sulfur rich core of that body, you can allow, if you can allow merger of that silicate reservoir to merge with the proto-earth silicate reservoir, you can establish the CNS abundance pattern for our planet's BSE. And when you do that, the size of that impactor relative to the size of our present day planet in terms of mass, it turns out to be somewhere between 5 to 6% to 10% of the mass of our present day planet. So close to a Mars-sized body having a sulfur-rich core could have that right type of CNS abundance pattern as we observe in our present day bulk silicate Earth. So if we allow a relatively efficient merger of the core of that embryo with the core of our planet, and mixing of the mantle of that planetary embryo with the mantle of the proto-Earth, then you can establish that carbon, nitrogen, sulfur abundance pattern that we see at the present day. Okay, so on one hand, it sounded like, oh, wow, that's like too good to be true, and kind of like as if this is like a magic bullet. But interestingly, and this is not driven by our work directly, after all, the moon forming impact has always been invoked to be a process where a Mars-sized planetary embryo, impacted the Earth and produced the moon and final makeup of the Earth. So in that sense, this kind of may point towards the same process where a Mars-sized embryo having a sulfur-rich core not only made the moon, but also at least established a major part of the volatile abundance pattern of the silicate reservoir that we see at the present day. So this is what then our kind of like the summary story was for this part of the talk. There was a formation of a Mars-sized planetary embryo. In that type of process, the core formation in that planetary embryo was more of an equilibrium process. But because the core was sulfur-rich, carbon got saturated in the core, and that carbon got expelled to enrich the silicate reservoir in carbon. And then accordingly, this planetary embryo's silicate layer was superchondritic carbon-nitrogen ratio. And then if you allow that type of silicate matrix to merge with the proto-Earth, you can, and that could be the moon forming impact itself, that would allow you to establish the carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur abundance pattern at that level. And because this is kind of a relatively large impact, because the size of that body is close to Mars size, we think it's not unreasonable that in that case, the core of that body will more or less directly merge with the core of the proto-Earth. So the metal silicate exchange in that final stage would be relatively limited. And as a consequence, whatever the abundance pattern of major volatiles were in this embryo would be mostly transferred to that of our planet. So that's kind of, I guess, the first major part of my talk. In this one, what we did, we sort of, through this many different experiments in this system, we can show that the silicate fractions and the surface of rocky planets would acquire different budgets of these major volatiles depending on the conditions of accretion, either reduced or oxidized. And if you allow equilibrium core formation to dictate the volatile abundance pattern for our planet, carbon should be more depleted relative to sulfur, followed by nitrogen. But that's not exactly what we see, at least that's not what we estimate at the present day. So that means the terrestrial carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and sulfur budget was not established by equilibrium core formation in our planet or by atmospheric loss gain mechanism. However, similar processes could have been very important for a planetary embryo that really was the supplier of these major volatiles to our planet. So larger planets with protracted growth history like ours probably got a significant dose of these major volatiles through differentiated bodies, where the silicate layers of those differentiated bodies got or managed to get different types of volatile abundance pattern depending on the core composition being very different in that type of bodies. Okay, so with that, I'll kind of wrap up this part and move on to kind of for the last maybe 15 minutes or so, quickly tell you guys about the latest adventure that one of the latest adventures that Daman led us into. And here our thought process is evolving, and the story I just told you guys, that one theme is going to remain the same. So this importance of differentiation, or the parent body differentiation, or planetesimal differentiation in establishing the volatile element abundance pattern is similar. But up to this point, our ideas were still dominantly shaped by this concept that um, the proto-Earth was not volatile free, but probably was volatile depleted, and major volatiles kind of came in our planet towards late, not so-called late accretion process or late veneer process, but through later impact processes, right? But then that really begs the question, where did the volatiles come from, and was the inner solar system truly volatile free all the way, and did we get our volatiles sort of towards the late stage of the major accretional phase? So this is where a lot of work has been going on over the last 10 years or so in the community, mostly driven by sort of very detailed isotopic work by Thorsten Klein's group, Rich Walker, and many others in the community. So the idea here is the initial architecture in the protoplanetary disk around the sun was something like is shown here. There was, at the very, very early stage, there was infalling of matter was CAI-like isotopic composition, and then there was viscous expansion of the disk that got spread out. And then as the effect of the supernova-derived material gradually got depleted, the infalling matter changed from carbonaceous composition to NC, or non-carbonaceous type of composition, as the late infalling material. And because of that, we see this type of distinct dichotomy that I kind of shown in Paul Warren's one of the earlier figures before. Like when you look at these nucleosynthetic anomalies in different elements, the NC reservoirs and the CC reservoirs plot at two distinct clusters, right? So there is, what that suggests that as these different bodies were forming, there was not much of a communication between this outer solar system reservoir and the inner solar system reservoirs. And Jupiter has been credited or blamed for that, depending on how you look at it, for this lack of mixing between the two reservoirs, or the separation of the two reservoirs. NC reservoirs are inside Jupiter's orbit, CC reservoirs are outside. And at much later scale, at much later scale, there was scattering of the CC materials to the inner part of the system through migration of Jupiters and so on. So in that concept, the major kind of almost like textbook level of information on this is there was a huge thermal gradient in the protoplanetary disk, and only things that were metallic or silicates that could condense in the inner part, and water ice and CO2, CH4, N2 ices, they were only stable at much farther away, much farther away from the current location of our inner solar system planets. And only way we could get these volatiles delivered to the inner part of the disk is through migration of giant planets and scattering of these volatile rich materials to the inner part of the disk. So inner part was volatile poor, outer was volatile rich, and there was inward scattering of the CC bodies at later stage either through some small flux of pebbles going through the pressure bump created by Jupiter, or by migration of Jupiter itself, right? So again, the main idea is inner solar system was volatile depleted or volatile poor. So, and this has been kind of the idea all along. But interestingly, right, and this is Steve Desch's relatively recent work that shows, yes, probably all the inner solar system measurement materials were, in this case, he's talking about water, but water depleted, and all the water bearing materials were farther out, created by this gap, created by Jupiter, and later mixing must have brought the volatiles in. But again, there have been many bodies that formed fairly early, right after the birth of the solar systems. And we know there are evidence, right, that these bodies started to differentiate, because these are, we have iron meteorite parent bodies, right, both that are inside and outside with CC as well as NC characteristics. That means we know these planetesimals or small planetary embryos already underwent differentiation. So we kind of wanted to probe both the temporal as well as the spatial scale of potential availability of volatiles through the lens of iron meteorites. And Daman kind of came up with the idea that, okay, maybe we should be focusing on, volatiles, major volatiles in the iron meteorites themselves, and what that might be telling us. So, here many of you are much more of an expert on iron meteorites than I am here in this audience. These are cores of earliest formed protoplanets. This type of differentiation is actually one of the earliest in our solar system, as early as 0.3 million years after the formation of CAI. And after the disruption of the parent bodies, we occasionally get these iron meteorites. So in a way, this is our closest to what we can get to a core of a planetary body, right? So tracing volatile inventory in the disk, we wanted to do that via major volatiles, water, carbon, and nitrogen. But the problem is hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, they all have only 2 stable isotopes, and we can't use things like triple oxygen isotope plots to figure out the genetic relationship between these two. So what can be done instead is compare the stable isotopes of major volatiles with other well-studied isotopic systems in iron meteorites, such as those nucleosynthetic anomalies that Thorsten Klein's group and Rich and others have been working on. So that's what Daman tried to do in this kind of just a neat idea, really just an observational paper here. The problem with hydrogen, there are limited measurements. Carbon, there is not a huge isotopic variations, but nitrogen instead shows a lot of concentrational variation in iron meteorites, but within each class of iron meteorites, although nitrogen contents vary quite a bit, the nitrogen isotopes themselves, delta 15N, lies within a relatively small range, right? So that's the point here. Nitrogen content varies quite a bit, but you can define nitrogen isotope kind of composition within a relatively narrow range. So what Daman then observed is when you plot delta 15N values with other non-volatile isotopic compositions of iron meteorites, the inner solar system and the outer solar systems, and again, these are defined entirely based, in this case, for epsilon nickel, right? So it's not defined based on nitrogen isotopes, but when you define that CC versus NC based on the x-axis, the nitrogen isotopes end up plotting at 2 distinct clusters as well. And we see that in delta 15N nickel space, we see that in delta 15N tungsten isotope, delta 15N molybdenum, delta 15N ruthenium. In all of these systems, nitrogen isotopes, in that sense, between the 2 groups, they correlate with the non-volatile isotopes, right? So the CC and NC were distinct, not only for these other non-volatile isotopic systems, they were distinct with nitrogen as well. And of course, it's important to pay attention to the scale, that for nitrogen, the variability is huge. Here, it's in the epsilon scale, like, fraction, or maybe 1 or 2 at best. Here, you are looking at a much larger separation. So what this tells us is very early, there was separation of the inner and the outer solar system reservoirs, and the outer solar systems were relatively enriched in 15N, and inner solar system was relatively depleted in 15N, but wasn't nitrogen free, right? Remember, in all of these sort of classic textbook stuff, the idea is nitrogen, water, everything came from the outer reservoirs, right? But that doesn't seem to be the case. At least the earliest formed protoplanets and the differentiation as we can sample through these iron meteorites, they show presence of nitrogen, and not only the presence of nitrogen with a distinct isotopic composition in the inner solar system bodies. So if you think about the temporal evolution of the iron meteorite parent bodies, there was undifferentiated, then there was a formation of maybe some sort of internal magma motion or internal differentiation with the formation of the core, and you had the undifferentiated crust. So, and then finally you generated something like that, and disruption of a body such as the one with the rightmost image eventually would allow us to sample the core of iron meteorite parent bodies. the question is, what was the origin of nitrogen in iron meteorites, right? There could be several possibilities, like nebular ingassing or equilibration with nebular gas, or metal silicate differentiation, the ones we have been investigating. So this is that plot, just to get some idea, how did nitrogen get incorporated in these in these magmatic irons. Many of them are magmatic irons. So what is shown here in pink, the horizontal band, is the nitrogen abundance that's observed in the iron meteorites. And on x-axis is the pressure for the gas, and the gray vertical band gives you the range of the nebular gas pressure that has been estimated. So what you can see is, if just nebular ingassing was the cause of nitrogen incorporation in these magmatic irons, you will get nitrogen abundance that is much, much lower than what we observe in these iron meteorites. So nebular ingassing cannot, with any reasonable range, cannot really explain the nitrogen concentration of iron meteorites. So then the question was, what else could be the cause? Well, as we discussed before, presence of core means there was probably at least some sort of an internal magma ocean in these bodies, even if it's not a fully external magma ocean, but some internal magmatic differentiation. So metal silicate partitioning in liquid state could be a player which established the nitrogen budget of the iron meteorite parent bodies, and that's what is observed here. In this, what we did, there are some newer experiments we did. The previous nitrogen partitioning that we studied before were done in graphite saturated conditions, which we think is not quite directly relevant for iron meteorite parent bodies, because the irons are relatively low in carbon. So we subsequently did some more experiments in graphite free systems in MgO capsules. And interestingly, what we observed is nitrogen nitrogen partitioning as a function of oxygen fugacity maintains that similar pattern, but nitrogen is more siderophile. And when we take that type of systematics into account, we can show that core formation or metal silicate separation at reasonable range of conditions of pressures can actually match or even exceed the value of nitrogen abundances in these iron meteorites. So we think equilibrium core formation, and maybe followed by some devolatilization related loss, can establish the nitrogen abundance in the iron meteorite parent bodies, along with establishing the nitrogen isotope composition. So again, in this last part, I guess the observation led us to kind of conclude that the protoplanetary disk around young sun, as a function of the heliocentric distance, it wasn't like that the volatiles were all only in the outer part of the disk, and the inner rocky planet forming region was entirely volatile free to begin with. At least through the lens of nitrogen, what we are learning, there was nitrogen at both inner and outer part of the system from very early on, because we are looking at this through iron meteorites. The inner part was 15N poor, outer part was 15N rich, and that separation was established. So this picture, the one I pulled up probably from some web textbook stuff, that's not what I think is realistic for our solar system. At least there was nitrogen in both inner and outer part. And interestingly, so this is what we have shown here. The CC iron meteorites are higher 15N. The NC iron meteorites are depleted here. And all the rocky bodies, especially that of the bulk silicate earth, they all plot in between that of the CC iron meteorite group and the NC iron meteorite group in terms of the nitrogen isotopes. So of course, this is a little bit model dependent, but then what we could do is just by assuming there is limited fractionation of nitrogen during nitrogen isotopes during core formation, we can do a simple mixing calculations, taking the average population of nitrogen isotopes of the CC reservoir, average nitrogen isotope composition of the NC reservoir, and do these mixing games depending on what you assume as the nitrogen abundance in the NC versus CC reservoir. Is it 1:1 or 1:4? But interestingly, what this suggests that for the bulk silicate earth, in terms of nitrogen isotope composition, as much as 30 to 60% of that nitrogen isotopic composition of our planet must have come from NC reservoir and not CC. So the previous thought would have been that, oh, all nitrogen, probably along with water, came from outer solar system materials. But what this is suggesting that a good chunk of the nitrogen in the inner solar system planets came from the region itself, not from scattering of materials from the outer solar system. So that's kind of the summary outlook of the second part. I kind of already said all of these. Within less than a million years, there was separation of the disk, and there was nitrogen in both parts having distinct isotopic compositions. Then there was scattering of the materials and some mixing. And eventually the inner rocky planets that grew, that took contributions from both CC and NC. So that means the present day Earth, or at least the silicate fraction of the present day Earth in terms of nitrogen isotope, contains nitrogen both from the outer as well as the inner solar system reservoirs. So that means major volatiles likely were available throughout the growth history of rocky planets, not just through these late giant impacts and so on. And with that, I guess I will stop and take questions. I'll put out the acknowledgement slides and yeah, how you can follow us.
Thank you very much, Raj. That was fascinating. Do people have questions? Oh, Monghak has a question.
Yes, thank you for your explanation for formation of our planet. I have a question relating to that. I was just wondering, how is there any evidence that suggests that there's just a two large planetary body collision, or there's more than two? And is that common in the inner solar system or just Earth? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, so there have been many dynamical simulations for rocky planet formation, and we are now, through our Clever Planets collaboration, we are now trying to combine these geochemical and fractionation constraints with dynamical models of rocky planet formation. So through n-body simulations, what we can sort of understand what has probably gone on, that there have been many impacts, not just one final giant impact. There have been many giant impacts throughout. So the way to think about it, at least at the very initial phase of growth of a rocky planet, it was probably through pebble accretion or through planetesimal accretion. And then after it probably acquired, half the mass of the present day Earth, there have been multiple giant impacts. So the impact I talked about potentially is probably the final giant impact, because after that it's a model assumption, right? Like after that impact, I am keeping my system closed, meaning I'm establishing the bulk silicate Earth volatile abundance pattern fully after that impact. So in that sense, that impact has to be the final one, or the penultimate moon forming impact. But leading up to that, there can be many other smaller impacts where differentiated bodies are merged, and that's what kind of all these n-body simulations sort of suggest, that there have been many of these accretional events. I don't know whether that fully answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, and then I guess I have another question, was whether it is a common feature in all of inner solar system or just Earth.
That's a good question. Well, from the time scale, all the chronometry that we have, and again, Rich can correct me if I'm mixing things up. For all the different chronometries that have been used in terms of sort of timing of core formation or growth. For example, Mars is thought to be a planetary embryo, meaning it grew to its final or near final mass very shortly after the birth of the solar system, almost within the time scale of the dissipation of the disk itself, or at the fag end of the dissipation of the disk within 9-10 million years. Vesta grew even more quickly. So not all the inner solar system bodies probably suffered giant impacts, but I'm sure there are other slightly different ideas about that. But I would think at least our planet Venus probably had similar histories, given the size and given the location, in the final location in the disk. Laura had a question, looks like. Oh, there are many.
Well, I was waiting for Megan to tell me to go ahead, but I guess she did instead.
I can see some of the hands.
I'm going to put a long hand and ask two questions actually here. They are both related actually to the second part of the talk. The first one is you told us about two clusters of composition from the isotopes plots that you showed. And I was wondering, looking at those plots, if it's not just about equally reasonable to say there's really one big cluster and 2C is something different. Because that's the only one that has very high 15 nitrogen. And, you know, somewhere, if you don't put the colors in there, you have a nice cloud. I mean, except maybe for the ruthenium ones, but that's no, rutil. I don't know what that is. Sorry, I'm not a geochemist. But I see everything is clustered in one place, and there's just these 2C up there. So I just wonder what would that mean as an alternative explanation. And the second question is what with solar system dynamics. So that might be separate. Maybe you want to address that now.
So I'm assuming this is the figure you're referring to.
Yes, that is.
Yeah. So okay, I'm okay. So, I'll admit, right? This was really a data mining project, right? We took whatever literature data were available for the nitrogen isotopic compositions of these various iron meteorites and their other isotopic systematics. So it's literally a compilation. I think there needs to be probably a targeted work where, you know, from the same aliquot you measure both and try to develop this, refine this. Yeah. So that's a good question. This is what we have. So now I'm guessing you are talking about this versus this, is it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the four categories at the bottom could be merged with the one highlighted in red, and I wouldn't have any problem saying that.
Right. So it's let me go to this figure. Yeah. So the question is it two clusters versus gradient, right? Like that. So this is probably a better one. They all are, so all the CC ones, even if you leave these guys out,
that's
all the
only one that's different.
Well, yeah, right. So if you leave this out, but still all of the CC iron meteorites have positive delta 15N. All the NC, and again, remember the CC-NC classification, we are not doing based on nitrogen isotopes. We are doing that based on all these other isotopic systematics, right? In that classification. So all these ones have positive delta 15N in CC, and all of these ones have negative delta 15N. Now, does that mean there was like a more of a continuous gradation, or was it clusters? I'm open to either at this point, to be honest with you, right? I won't push one or the other, but it was interesting to us that through the lens of major volatile isotopic systems, we didn't know whether this observation has been made, and in terms of like trying to see correlations. It's interesting that within group there isn't a correlation. So it could be what you are saying, that like that's interesting to probe. Like within a given iron meteorite group, we didn't see any correlation, right? It's only across the CCNC we see this broad separation, or at least distinction. Yeah.
No, that's fine. I mean, I was just saying, to me, the natural break is between 2C and everybody else together. So, but that's all right. Mm-hmm. The other things, if I can very quickly, and maybe there's just no answer to this, but the dynamics in the very final statics that you showed of the solar system had exchange where outer solar system material was transferred inward, but not outward. And I'm just curious as to why there is no equivalent, like inner material would go, solar system material will go outward, because in a way, ideas about migration of Jupiter can make gaps in the asteroid belts, which is more inside than else, and that's done by scattering objects elsewhere, sometimes out of the solar system altogether. So I'm just wondering why none of the inner material that you highlighted in red ends up mixed in the outer solar system.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And again, my knowledge on this one is limited. I wonder how much of an observation we have to rule out that possibility completely. I think observationally we are more skewed towards observing, mixing of the outer one, because okay, where would we be looking for that type of signature? We may want to look for signature like that in the outer objects, right? Where our observation at this point is limited. They're right. So again, somebody in the audience, Rich, or somebody may know specific observation which points to that reverse mixing that you were talking about, Laura. But I think observationally, we are always going to be biased to be able to observe that outer material coming in, because after all the observables we have are mostly in the inner solar system, right? We can, right? So in terms of the rocky systems or meteorites, everything is skewed towards the inner system. So that's what I can think of.
Yeah, thank you.
Richard, do you want to ask a question?
Sure, I have two questions as well. What are you, at the very beginning when you were talking about hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur from chondrates, what are you using as chondrates? Are you just using CI? Because CI is very, very different to CMs and CVs and all those other guys. So I'm just curious about what you're using as like a canonical chondritic composition, and whether you can justify using CIs rather than anything else, and how much variation is there?
That's a great question. Too bad I don't have that plot with me. The normalization I showed you was done with CI. Okay, but again, I can send you after my talk the paper, our chapter in 2019 book, where we plotted, like in terms of that CH, CN, CS ratio, we compared all the classes of carbonaceous chondrites, CV, CM, everything. And the main observation that none of those bodies actually line up with the bulk silicate earth holds, even when you compare with all the other classes of carbonaceous chondrite, not just CI. But for that plot I showed you here, it is true that the normalization was, well, you'll have to choose one, like that normalization was done with CI. But in terms of these major volatile elemental ratios, there is no current like analyzed or meteorite in our collection, at least, that matches the BSC abundance, including all of the carbonaceous chondrites or anything else.
My other question kind of relates to this plot, in that if you plotted chondrites on here and urolites and things like that on here, some of this apparent correlation kind of disappears. So urolites, which are NC, plot way over to the right here. They're like hundreds of per mil, some of them. So they don't really quite. Why would they not fit? Whereas the ions seem to fit very well.
Yeah, so we made that. Of course, I mean, this is something that came up in the review as well. Like we made the argument that all achondritic, meteorite class or any silicate metal mixtures, in terms of nitrogen, they are much more prone, both in terms of their isotopes, but definitely in terms of their concentration, they are much more prone to modification. The core formation process is such that once you partition things into the core, it acts as it acts much better as an isolated reservoir than any of these other bodies. So in that sense, I would strongly argue that the irons are, in that sense, much better keeper of their early memory as opposed to any of these other bodies you're talking about. That's why we didn't want to complicate this by plotting, chondrites and everything, which may or may not, for various reasons, show the correlation. So yeah, that's an interesting, that's we thought about that. We just don't know what would be the best way to do it without doing new analysis, of course, which we are not doing. We're just taking literature data.
Raj, I know you have to rush off soon. Do you have time for another question?
Oh, that's a good point. Oh no, I have 5 minutes still. Rich.
Rich.
This is more of a comment than a question. So the 2Cs are notably different. There are some other iron meteorites like Wiley that are even more notably different than the normal CECs in iron meteorite land. And my former PhD student, Emily Warsham, published a paper last year where she put together tungsten, ruthenium, and molybdenum data and argued for the isotopic variations in those three elements reflecting both redox conditions and volatility conditions. And it's something you might want to think in terms of as you move from nitrogen, perhaps to thinking again about carbon and hydrogen as to the effects of redox and other factors in driving some of these isotopic variations. I guess the other thing I'd say is there is no law that says there can only be CC and NC, so you want to be a little cautious there. It's possible, perhaps not probable, but possible that a group like the 2Cs really formed in a genetically different reservoir from most CCs and most NCs. So.
Yeah, no, point well taken. The distinction of 2Cs, referring to Emily's work, I'm guessing you are not talking in terms of them being even different in nitrogen. You're talking in terms of the other isotopic systematics, correct?
Yeah, but the nitrogen difference is really interesting in that you know, if you look at the odd man out group, it is that for it's the 2Cs for both nitrogen and ruthenium. But interestingly enough, it's for nitrogen and molybdenum, but not really so much for ruthenium or tungsten. So.
Yeah. So one thing, it's a great comment. One thing we started doing is, after all, we are trying to infer something about the parent bodies of these iron meteorites in terms of nitrogen isotope compositions, but what we are looking at is the irons themselves. There could be some nitrogen isotope fractionation during metal silicate separation, and there are some data in literature, although really all over the place. So we are doing actually now some metal silicate nitrogen isotope fractionation experiments. And what needs to be resolved, again, literature data are really just all over the place, is whether or not there is a strong oxygen fugacity control on nitrogen isotope fractionation between metals and silicates, and whether or not that has some, whether that affects this observation you are also talking about in terms of 2C being some sort of a redox difference with respect to the other CCs. So yeah, I would say, yeah, more details need to be worked out, and we are on part of it at least.
Yeah, there's certainly overlap between CC and NC, but it looks like on average, CCs have proportionally smaller cores, which is suggestive of more oxidized.
More oxidized, exactly, yeah.
Fantastic. Do you have time to comment on whether you think the hydrogen budget could also be dominated by expulsion from cores?
Hydrogen budget. So far, we are just getting into hydrogen ourselves in our group in terms of core-mantle fractionation. But the existing data that are available from other groups suggests that hydrogen, at least at modest magma ocean conditions, 10, 15 GPa and so on, is not so siderophile. It's mildly siderophile to even lithophile. So in terms of the core contributing hydrogen to through expulsion is unlikely in that sense. Carbon can be much more siderophile, but then changing core composition, making sulfur rich, silicon rich, can expel carbon. With hydrogen, frankly, that level of details have not been worked out. Like, okay, what's the effect of silicon or sulfur? Whatever has been worked on is sort of more garden variety iron nickel alloy melt. And in that system, hydrogen isn't super siderophile. But yeah, silicon effect, sulfur effect, that would be interesting to look at. Nobody has, to my knowledge.
Well, we better let you get to your class, but let's all thank Raj again. Yeah, thank you very much for visiting and for a really interesting talk.
Thanks for having me, Megan. Really appreciate it.